Buongiorno. Good morning. Guten Morgen. That's 3 languages. Good morning. Hello. Welcome. Thank you. My name's Mike Fisher. I'm a Professor of Evidence-Based Social Work at the University of Bedfordshire in England. Microphone is not on. It was on. How's that? Is that getting better? So my name's Mike Fisher. I'm here to introduce Ed Mullen, and unusually we are going to try and keep to time and get through an interesting session. It's a huge honour to be here introducing Ed. For many of us, it seems that Ed Mullen has been simply there for all the time that I've been doing social work. Ed has been there. And 2 days ago we were counting up the number of years, and it was 54 years, which is longer than many people in the audience, I think, have been on this planet. And it gives you a particular perspective on social work research. For me, and I think for many people in the audience, Ed's work has always been a central reference point. It's been a place where you go to read new thinking, to capture what has been said in the past. And I just want to mention Ed's work, particularly in the development of building practitioner-researcher partnerships. One of the things that's always impressed me about Ed's work is his respect for practice, his ability to engage with practice-researcher relationships. Ed was there when task-centered work was being developed. If you want to know about outcomes measurement in social work, read Ed's book on outcomes measurement. It's a key text. And most recently, Ed's work has been really critical to rethinking what we mean by evidence-based policy and practice. There's a state-of-the-art review of effectiveness studies in social work, and the thing that's impressive is there is always new thinking. It's not about the past, it's about the future. It's about what direction is evidence-based practice going in now. So it's a huge pleasure to introduce Ed Mullen. Ed is Professor Emeritus. I must get this right, so I'm going to read this. He's Professor Emeritus in the Willma and Albert Musher Chair at Columbia University, New York. And it's a great honor to welcome you and to give you the floor. Ed Mullen.
And for those of you that are limited to English, good morning. Thank you, Mike. I am honored to be introduced by Professor Mike Fisher, who has contributed so much to social work in Europe and beyond. I thank Professors Ian Shaw, Sylvia Fargoni, and Rector Walter Lorenz for inviting me to present this lecture and to visit this beautiful city of Bolzano, Bolzan. I want to talk today about some new thinking regarding evidence in the context of evidence-based policy and practice. Evidence-based policy and practice has become an important conceptual framework across the human services. I propose a reformulation of the concept of evidence as applied to evidence-based practice effectiveness questions. As a basis for this reformulation, ideas about evidence are examined from cross-disciplinary and multidisciplinary perspectives. I propose a modification of the evidence-based framework and draw out implications for researchers, all of you, and for those conducting systematic reviews, and for those developing guidelines. That's my agenda. This topic is important and timely for 2 reasons. First, in a number of countries, the research agenda and funding is being driven increasingly by evidence-based practice. I'm going to use the term EBP. Just remember, I'm talking about evidence-based policy and practice. So as I say, in a number of countries, the research agenda and funding is being driven increasingly by evidence EBP requirements. Regulatory and funding agencies are requiring policies and practice be evidence-informed. Secondly, human service professionals are being trained as evidence-based practitioners. Accordingly, research organizations and researchers are expected to produce and translate findings into evidence that can support decisions about which policies, programs, and practices to undertake. That's the challenge to researchers, those of you that are producing evidence. Nevertheless, there is much confusion and disagreement about the meaning and role of evidence in the EBP context. Regarding timeliness, Hodge, Lacasse, and Benson's findings underscore the importance of evidence-based practice in social work. After identifying the 100 most frequently cited articles in social work, they conclude, quote, among the various topics that appeared among the 100 most cited articles, evidence-based practice and or social work research was the most prominent topic at the top of the list. Evidence-based practice, they continue, is perhaps the topic of primary importance within the profession. And I know Jeannie Marsh has been examining the literature and is having a session as well on a topic related to this. Nancy Cartwright, an epistemologist, in her presidential address to the Philosophy of Science Association, underscores the importance of the evidence-based policy movement at the international level when she writes, quote, there is a takeover movement fast gaining influence in development economics, a movement that demands that predictions about development outcomes be based on randomized, controlled trials. The problem, she continues, the problem it takes up of using evidence of efficacy from good studies to predict whether a policy will be effective if we implement it is a general one and affects us all. The current emphasis on EBP raises fundamentally important identity and ethical issues for social work. I concur with Hans W. Otto and Holger Ziegler when they observe, quote, this manualization seems to come closer to cookbook social work than to ideas of professional autonomy and reflexivity. However, they continue, it may be that a social work practice based on properly conducted causal description is superior to a social work practice based on causal explanations. They continue, it may also be that a dissemination of evidence-based guidelines is more effective and more efficient than the quest to disseminate empirically grounded understandings, interpretation, and theories to empirically and theoretically well-educated professionals in social work. They continue, if this proves to be true, then it might actually be reasonable to renounce the idea of reflexive professionalism in social work and to join the evidence-based practice movement. Whatever the case, it seems that social work is at a crossroads. Because of this crossroads issue, it is important for groups within the profession, especially researchers, to be fully informed about what is at stake. While the issues involved are many, the meaning of evidence is central. EBP is a decision-making process with two complementary components, namely, first, the process of evidence-based practice, and second, the use of evidence-based research-tested effective practices. The evidence-based practice process shown on the left side of this slide is used by practitioners, and I include policymakers as practitioners, used by practitioners to make decisions about which evidence-based research tested effective practices to use on the right side of the slide. The idea of evidence is central to both the process of evidence-based practice and to the identification of evidence-based research-tested effective practices. The left oval, labeled evidence-based practice, is a process practitioners can use when providing services to individuals, communities, organizations, or at the policy level to whole populations. And you should have a copy of all of these slides. The EBP process involves a critical assessment of available evidence about each of the domains shown on this slide. With decision-making at the center, consideration is given to the best available evidence about each of the circles shown on the slide. That is, about benefits, harms, and costs of alternative interventions, about client system characteristics, client system needs, client system state, preferences, and values. Very client-focused. About resources required and available, including practitioner expertise as a resource and practitioner experience as a resource, as well as team and organizational resources, and relevant environmental and organizational variables. For informed decision-making, then, evidence is required about variables in each of these information domains. I only address the idea of evidence pertaining to the top circle, best available research evidence, and even more specifically, only to evidence about effectiveness questions. And because I'm emphasizing that slice of the evidence pie, you always need to keep in mind you need evidence about all of this to be an evidence-based practitioner. But I only have time to deal with this one little slice. For effectiveness questions, it is traditional to define evidence quality, not relevance, evidence quality, using a hierarchical scheme such as shown here. Filtered evidence coming from systematic evidence reviews and critical appraisal topical reviews are taken as providing the highest quality of evidence traditionally. Unfiltered evidence comes in descending order of quality from individual randomized trials, that is RCTs. So when I refer to RCTs, I'm referring to randomized controlled trials, cohort studies, case-controlled studies, and lastly, from background information such as from mechanistic reasoning about causes and expert opinion. There are evidence hierarchies for other types of EBP questions, but my concern is only with effectiveness questions. As I will show, this particular hierarchical view of evidence quality, which is dominant, is controversial, especially when applied to social work. And as I will argue, evidence quality needs to be secondary to evidential relevance. Evidence. And the remainder of my remarks, with that as background as to what I mean by evidence-based practice. The remainder of my remarks now will be about ideas about evidence in this context and then implications. My paper, by the way, if anyone wants a copy, email me and I'll send it along. I'm sticking pretty closely to my consolidated version here so I can get through this in 50 minutes. Evidence-based practice can be considered a rational process for making decisions in the face of uncertainties. This process involves making uncertain inferences, usually using qualitative probabilistic reasoning about hypotheses based on available evidence. As James Franklin notes, quote, "How probable a hypothesis is on given evidence determines the degree of belief it is rational to have in that hypothesis, if that is all the evidence one has that is relevant to it. As documented by Franklin in his detailed historical survey of methods of evidence evaluation, or of how mankind has used rational methods for dealing with uncertainty, what he calls the science of conjecture, such methods have been used since ancient times in law, science, commerce, philosophy, and logic. At the outset, I want to underscore for those of us interested in conceptualization of evidence in the context of EBP that there are many ways scientific evidence can be created. Michael Rawlins underscores this when he writes, quote, "For those with lingering doubts about the nature of evidence itself, I remind them that while Gregor Mendel developed the monogenetic theory of inheritance on the basis of experimentation, Charles Darwin conceived the theory of evolution as a result of close observation. And Albert Einstein's special theory of relativity was a mathematical description of certain aspects of the world around us." I want to turn to cross-disciplinary perspectives. Since I think those of us in EBP can learn from how evidence is viewed in other disciplines, I begin my discussion of evidence by viewing how the idea of evidence is conceived in various disciplines, especially those disciplines that have been at this business for some time, especially in the science of conjecture, evidence science, law, and philosophy, specifically epistemology and philosophy of science. Recently, there has been much interest in exploring commonalities across the disciplines regarding concepts, principles, and methods of evidence and inference. That interest has been piqued by the emphasis across disciplines in the idea of evidence-based policy and practice. One such program, called Evidence, Inference, and Inquiry Towards an Integrated Science of Evidence, was established at University College London with participants from education, economics, forensic science, health, history, law, philosophy of science, statistics, and psychology. Twining notes that although a wide range of diverse projects within an array of disciplines were represented, the UCLA Evidence Project commonalities could be found as to how evidence, inference from evidence could be viewed. And I quote Twining, "Notwithstanding differences, all of our projects involve, as part of the enterprise, drawing inferences from evidence to test hypotheses and justify conclusions, and the logic of this kind of inquiry is governed by the same principles." David Hume, a participant in the UCL project, proposes a, quote, "substance-blind science of evidence," which has as its core a scheme for classifying evidence. Hume proposes two classificatory dimensions that I think are important for us to keep in mind. That is relevance, the first criterion, and credibility, the second criterion. The relevance dimension asks how the information or data bear upon what we are trying to prove or disprove. He proposes that such data only become evidence, they only become evidence, when their relevance to hypotheses being considered is established by defensible arguments or chains of reasoning. I'm going to keep coming back to this issue of arguments. In Hume's view, such evidence is directly relevant if I can form a defensible argument or chain of reasoning linking the evidence to the hypotheses I entertain. Indirectly relevant if it bears upon the strength or weakness of links in the chain of reasoning set up by directly relevant evidence. The credibility dimension, according to Hume, involves asking how do you, the evaluator of the evidence, stand in relation to the evidence, and depending on one's answer, different credibility questions arise. Different credibility questions arise. For example, tangible evidence can be directly observed by the evaluator, whereas, as we know in law, testimonial evidence comes in the form of an assertion from another person. Beyond these two classificatory dimensions of individual items of evidence, Hume's scheme provides for classification of recurrent combinations of evidence into harmonious, dissonant, and redundant categories. I think these are relevant to how we rethink the notion of evidence in EBP. This common view of evidence across disciplines is nicely described by Susan Hack when she observes, "The core standards of good evidence and well-conducted inquiry are not internal to the sciences, but common to empirical inquiry of every kind. Respect for evidence, care in weighting it, and persistence in seeking it out are the standards," she says, "which we judge all inquirers, detectives, historians, investigative journalists, as well as scientists." Evidence in law. Writing from the perspective of law, Twining defines evidence accordingly. Evidence is a word of relation used in the context of argumentation. Again, argumentation. In that context, information has a potential role as relevant evidence if it tends to support or tends to negate, directly or indirectly, a hypothesis. One draws inferences from evidence in order to prove or disprove a hypothesis. The framework, again, is argument, the process is proof, and the engine is inferential reasoning from information. Because of the emphasis in EBP on using what has come to be called best evidence when making decisions, I found it of interest that Twining, in the context of law, cites Gilbert's book called The Law of Evidence, published way back in 1754, as advocating for a single organizing principle for bringing coherence into the law of evidence, namely, quote, the best evidence rule, which took the form of a rigid hierarchy of rules of weight. Twining states that since there are no rules of weight in the common law, Gilbert's hierarchy was ultimately rejected. It is interesting to note that Twining links Gilbert's hierarchical scheme to current proposals in EBP. He writes, "A similar error has been repeated throughout history, most notably in more recent doctrinaire versions of evidence-based medicine and evidence-based policy that have tried to formalize the weighting of evidence on the basis of peremptory rules prescribing hierarchies of weight and reliability." In the late 19th century, Thayer proposed the law of evidence, that it should provide for a series of exceptions to a general principle of admitting all relevant evidence without reference to rigid evidential hierarchies. All relevant evidence. Thayer formulated two principles which form the foundation for the modern law of evidence in common law systems. One, that nothing is to be received which is not logically probative of some matter requiring to be proved, or, in terms of the prior criteria, relevance. First point, relevance. Secondly, that everything which is thus probative should come in, unless a clear ground of policy of law excludes it. Have an open view of evidence. Twining cites Thayer and Wigmore's views on the law of evidence and the principle of proof as central to a rationalist tradition in common law which has as its core the idea of the pursuit of correct decision and in adjudication by rational means through argumentation based on evidence. Argumentation again. Philosophy. I must say it was an education for me writing this paper. And I have reams and reams and reams, if anyone is interested in wanting to go into any of this in more depth later on. Evidence and philosophy. A critical consideration of evidence-based policy and practice from the perspective of philosophy is overdue. Indeed, Glasgow, in his foreword to Harwick's 2011 book titled The Philosophy of Evidence-Based Medicine, reports that he searched Medline for titles which included evidence-based medicine and philosophy. And how many do you think he found? 6. All since 2005. I couldn't help but do my own search. I found 8. So, not much discussed. As noted by Kelly and Moore, little attention has been given to underlying sociological, epistemological, and philosophical questions underpinning the logic of scientific methods used in evidence-based medicine and health technology assessment. Yet, as they say, the whole business gives rise to interesting and important issues. John Warhol, commenting on evidence-based medicine, has noted, quote, obviously medicine should be evidence-based. I could say obviously social work should be evidence-based. The issues lie in the details. What exactly counts as evidence, they write, or he writes? Do certain kinds of evidence carry more weight than others? And if so, why? And how exactly should medicine be evidence-based? How exactly should social work be evidence-based? When it comes to these details, Warhol writes, the evidence-based medicine movement has got itself into a mess. Do you know that English word, mess? I don't know how you say it in German or Italian. He continues, in order to start to resolve this mess, we need to go back to basics. And that means, he says, turning to the philosophy of science, which is what I want to do now. My creation. I hope you can make sense of it. It's my cataloging of theories of evidential relationship in philosophy. I'm not going to, I warn you, I'm not going to talk about all of this. I do in my extended paper, but only some highlights that I think are relevant. Philosophical theories of evidential relationship have had major overarching influences, of course, on how social scientists have viewed evidence. As DeFat notes, a theory of evidential relation provides conditions necessary and sufficient for the truth of claims that some fact or set of facts is evidence for some hypotheses. Major theories can be categorized, as I have on this slide, into those that use probabilities in their account of evidence, and into qualitative theories which do not use probability, as shown on this slide. I only comment on 3 of these most relevant theories shown. The first is hypothetico-deductivism, which I assume nearly all of you are familiar with and which I was educated in. Hypothetical deductivism is an example of a qualitative theory of evidence not using probabilities on the lower right. It's described by DeFat as hypothetical deductivism, or HD, is popularly thought to constitute the scientific method. It was when I was educated. According to the simplest version of this approach, one invents a hypothesis and draws out its observational consequences. One then checks to see whether these consequences turn out to be true, and if so, one is said to have obtained evidence in favor of one's hypotheses. If the consequence turns out to be false, then one has refuted one's hypotheses. On this approach, then, evidence for a hypothesis is a true observational consequence of that hypothesis, while evidence against a hypothesis is a false observational consequence. Peter Atkinstein, who I've learned to respect greatly, the most contemporary, I think, philosopher, epistemologist of evidence and explanation, Peter Atkinstein summarizes the basic HD view, pointing out that it is both an objective view and an a priori, not empirical, view of evidence. Accordingly, some fact, he writes, taken to be true is evidence for a hypothesis that if that hypothesis entails a priori the fact. Whether a hypothesis entails that fact is objective, not dependent on whether anyone in particular believes or even knows about the hypothesis or fact or their logical relationship, writes Atkinstein. Atkinstein describes fancier versions of the HD view, which some of you I'm sure are familiar with, that invoke some idea of explanation as well, such as claiming that some fact is evidence for a hypothesis if and only if that hypothesis explains or is the best explanation or is the most probable explanation for the fact. The HD theory of the evidentiary relationship, as well as the fancier versions, are now seen by most philosophers of science as too problematic to be acceptable. The two key objections are the irrelevant conjunction and the competing hypothesis objections, which I assume many of you are familiar with, and I will not go into them. I simply want to make the point that I'm convinced these two and some other reasons really do make the HD view of evidence unacceptable for EBP, which should be a major shock for those of us caught up in that web. So now we've lost our foundation. Another popular theory of the evidentiary relationship, relying exclusively on probabilities, is the so-called increase in probability or positive relevance account, such as Bayesian statistical applications in EBP and social research. The idea is simply that some fact is evidence for some hypothesis if and only if that fact makes that hypothesis more or less probable. Like hypothetical deductivism, many find the increase in probability account problematic, at least as stated in this simple form. Peter Atkinstein, claims that requiring merely that a fact increase or decrease the probability of a hypothesis is too weak to call that fact as evidence, and therefore not a sufficient requirement. He further claims that some fact can count as evidence even though it does not change the probability of a hypothesis, and therefore this requirement is not necessary, neither necessary nor sufficient. I personally am convinced by Atkinstein's reasoning that neither the HD theory nor the increase in probability Bayesian theory of the evidentiary relationship stands up to a critical scrutiny within the context of EBP requirements. And my paper goes into much more detail, or you can look at the references if you want to think more about that. But I'm going to leave, for now, a rejection of those two views of evidence on the table. Atkinstein presents his view of evidence succinctly. Atkinson writes, "On my account, evidence for a hypothesis or a theory is supposed to provide a good reason for believing that the hypothesis or theory is true. In accordance with the definition I arrive at, Atkinstein, which reflects this idea, some fact is evidence for a hypothesis, is that a hypothesis is true only if, given that fact, the probability is high that there is an explanatory relationship between the hypothesis and the fact." Explanation. Atkinstein proposes three principles for his concept of objective evidence, which I like. First, the first principle of reasonable belief. If some fact is evidence for some hypothesis, then that fact needs to provide a good reason to believe the hypothesis, a good reason to believe. Second principle of reasonable belief. If some fact is a good reason to believe some hypothesis, unlike the HD view, then it cannot be a good reason to believe an incompatible hypothesis. And lastly, the empirical principle of objective evidence. In general, whether some fact is true, if true, is evidence for some hypothesis, is an empirical, not an a priori question. Those are Atkinstein's three key criteria. They're at a high level of abstraction, but they have implications. Nancy Cartwright, another epistemologist, contemporary epistemologist, and Jeremy Hardy are among the very few epistemologists who have applied philosophical reasoning to EBP. I want to take a few minutes to describe some of their suggestions, which I find pertinent. They identify a number of key questions that policymakers need to address for policies to be warranted and evidence-based. 1, did the policy work there? So if you are thinking about put on your policy hat or your research hat and you're thinking about designing a study, did the policy work there, somewhere, with some specific setting, population, or time? That's the efficacy question. Do we have evidence from studies about something working somewhere, there? Secondly, will the policy work here? That's the effectiveness question. That is, you as a researcher, a policymaker, want to know whether you should apply something that is evidence-based there in some future application. So the second question, will the policy work here? That's the effectiveness question. Thirdly, is there a causal relationship between policy and outcomes? That is, can you identify a theory, a logic model, a program theory, an explanatory system? Importantly, we often overlook, what support factors must be in place for the policy to work here? In other words, an intervention, a policy, is never all that it takes. You have to have a lot of other things in place. What were they when it worked there? Are they here? Are all of the above assumptions evidence-based, warranted? As you answer all those questions, do you have evidence to support your answers? And lastly, can answers be quantified into probabilities or at least into qualitative categories? Cartwright and Hardy propose that warranted evidence-based policy claims need to be formulated into convincing arguments, wherein evidence, quote, should appear in the argument as one or more premises securing the relevance of the evidence to the argument. They refer to evidential relevance as an account of what turns a trustworthy claim into a piece of evidence. In other words, data standing there is not evidence until it's put in the context of a reasonable argument like this, according to them. What would such an argument look like? Cartwright and Hardy propose the idea of an evidence pyramid as shown on this slide. They describe their idea of a justified argument. Quote, a justified argument for a policy is supported by evidence cast in the form of one or more premises, which in turn may be supported by additional evidence cast in the form of sub-arguments and so on until reaching what might be called self-evident premises. A good argument is one in which each of the premises is warranted, that is, justified by the evidence. An argument is weakened when one or more of the premises are not supported by good evidence. And to get a good argument from it works somewhere to it will work here, facts about causal principles here and there are needed. My adaptation of the evidence pyramid is shown on this slide. First, findings from systematic reviews examining all relevant and available efficacy and effectiveness studies would support a major premises in the argument that the intervention worked in the past, somewhere, there, upper left side of the slide. Second, findings from a horizontal search identifying the enabling and support variables that were required for the intervention to have worked there are also present here. That is, in the future application setting, would form a second major premises in the argument that the intervention will probably work here. Third, findings from a vertical search identifying the operative causal variables accounting for the effects in the past intervention there are present here in the future intervention, would support a third major premises in the argument that the intervention worked in the past and is likely to work in the future here. I expect that other premises would be added in any real argument, but these three are sufficient for this example. In this example, these three premises support an evidence-based argument that the intervention is likely to work in the future here, which in turn serves as a basis for a justified decision to try the intervention here. I doubt there is any one standardized best way to formulate an evidence-based argument, and I expect that in practice, evidence arguments are often a mix of evidence and persuasion. Just read Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. Where then can I find help in science, writes Cartwright in her most recent discussion of the importance of explanation in evidence-based practice and policy. She writes, where then can I find help in science, either with the problem of setting on the right level of abstraction to find shared explanatory principles or ascertaining what the abstract features in these principles consist in for both study and target populations. She writes, I am sure it takes both theory and local knowledge, neither of which, she writes, are much in favor in the EBP communities. She writes, without these, scientific studies like RCTs, which are so highly prized for the credibility they confer on their results, will not be explanatorily relevant and to the predictions about what will work for us in practice and policy. And she concludes, if explanatory relevance goes, so too goes evidential relevance. Then, she says, I have no scientific evidence to bring to bear, and evidence-based policy and practice is out the window. Implications. At the outset, I described a conceptualization of what constitutes EBP. In my concluding comments, I suggest how that conceptualization could be enhanced to bring the formulation into alignment with key points that I have made about the idea of evidence. As shown on this slide, EBP can be viewed as a 5-step process, whether you're at the policy or at the direct client level. It's a process that I assume that most of you are familiar with by now. I suggest that this familiar 5-step process be revised to include formulation of warranted evidence-based arguments, and that evidence appraisal be guided by the 3 high-level criteria of relevance, credibility, and strength, rather than rigid hierarchies. As shown on this slide, formulation of the evidential arguments along the lines suggested by Cartwright and Hardy should be included as a 4th step in the process, and reformulation of the argument following the assessment should be a 6th step in the process. I would also add ongoing assessment to the idea of initial assessment so that the argument can be revised in an open process. I believe that the view of evidence assessment and critical appraisal can be enhanced to bring it in line with the ideas I have reviewed as shown on this slide. As shown, sources of potential evidence are represented in each of these domains, beginning with information about client system preferences, values, and characteristics, consideration of practitioner system resources, preferences, values, and characteristics, environmental and organizational context, and resources, and best available research evidence. Best evidence should include findings about intervention effectiveness, causal roles or mechanisms, and support factors along the lines suggested by Cartwright and Hardy. Following Howick's evidence, best evidence should include findings from experimental as well as observational studies whose effect sizes outweigh the combined effects of plausible confounders, as well as high-quality mechanistic reasoning. This information should then be converted into justified evidence-based arguments, which in turn form the 4th step of the EB process as shown on the prior slide. Implications, in conclusion, implications for researchers, reviewers, and guideline developers. These are my speculations. Each of you, I hope, have been motivated to think anew. You may have other speculation, but this is where I come out now. In conclusion, I speculate about implications, as I say, for researchers engaged in the conduct of systematic reviews, and for guideline developers. For researchers, which I assume most of you are, different research strategies are required depending on the purpose of the intervention evaluation. Evaluations can seek to establish an explanatory causal relationship or, pragmatically, to determine the effects of interventions on a range of outcomes under varying conditions for different population subgroups. Investigators conducting studies designed to measure social intervention outcomes would do well to continue to conduct efficacy studies, such as RCTs, to specify capacities of interventions to affect intended outcomes, and to identify harmful effects as suggested by Cartwright and Hardy. Efficacy RCTs have the potential to establish an explanatory connection between interventions and outcomes as required by Atkinson's theory of evidential relationships, as well as Cartwright and Hardy's causal arguments. Second, and this is important, once capacities and safety have been established, investigators should undertake studies to examine effectiveness, using designs such as are now recommended for comparative effectiveness research, as shown on this slide. Recommended CER designs typically do not include explanatory RCTs. RCTs using placebo controls and blinding are typically not used. Rather, for effectiveness studies in the comparative effectiveness tradition, recommended designs seek to maximize examining complex interventions in realistic, complex social, cultural, political, historical contexts. CER seeks to produce evidence that is relevant, practical, and actionable. Ventgas, Moore, and Mesner's classification of recommended CER types and methods is shown on this slide. Both experimental and observational approaches are recommended for consideration as appropriate. However, traditional placebo-controlled double-blind RCTs are not included for CER. Rather, among experimental study types, pragmatic controlled trials, PCTs, are listed, as are cluster randomized trials, crossover designs, and so forth. We're running out of time, but as you see here, this is the range. This is a menu of available options to RCTs. Primary researchers should report findings. Another implication, I think. Primary researchers should report findings with sufficient specificity to provide the information needed to construct evidence arguments along the lines suggested by Cartwright and Hardy. Pragmatic controlled trials rather than explanatory RCTs are generally preferred over efficacy RCTs, as I said. In their 2009 article, Thorpe and Associates detailed distinctions between RCTs and PCTs and propose a tool that can be used to assess where a given study falls on 10 dimensions, defining characteristics of PCTs and RCTs as shown on this slide. This tool is now widely cited as the PRECISE tool. The PRECISE framework was originally developed to serve as a design guide, but it is now incorporated into as a well-known consort group system for reporting trials. Importantly, this framework allows for gradations rather than dichotomous views of trials. It's not either or RCT or PCT, but as you're designing a study and looking for the evidence, where do you want to be on these 10 dimensions with your study? PCTs are characteristically characterized by practicality so as to provide evidence to service users, practitioners, and policymakers in real-world decision-making contexts. I'm going to skip this. The next thing you have on the slide, you may want to check it out. I believe this may be the most recent Campbell review, and it, I think, is a very nice illustration of how systematic reviews might be done according to the principles that I've outlined. This recent review indeed incorporates quantitative RCTs and qualitative studies, observational studies. It identifies mechanisms. It is very good about identifying enabling conditions, moderating variables, mediating variables, explanatory contexts, and so forth. So I'm going to, we're running out of time, and I'm just going to refer you to that study as a good illustration of how reviewers, I think, need to attend to this. Bottom line, I think systematic reviewers need to loosen up their focus selection criteria in terms of typically looking only at RCTs. From an evidential perspective, a rule is look at all the available evidence if you're going to use it to make a decision. You are not justified in looking at only a piece of the evidence if it's going to guide real-world decision-making. So my message regarding reviewers, which I go into in more detail, is open up, look at all the available evidence, don't arbitrarily use some hierarchy to guide your decision-making. Use these higher-level criteria. So we're running out of time. Guideline developers, again, I go in to some detail for guideline developers. What it adds up to is, again, for guideline developers, open up, look at all the available evidence, specify the important context, or specify the important explanatory variables, give policymakers and practitioners real-world recommendations based on all the available evidence so that they can make decisions about what was found there and whether it will apply here. Guideline developers have to provide all that information if it's going to be relevant and useful. I conclude with issues and challenges. On your last slide, I do hope that my comments have stimulated, if not provoked, many of you to speculate about different ways of thinking about evidence in the context of EBP, as well as implications for how the EBP enterprise should be reshaped as moved into social work. In conclusion, I specify 6 key issues and challenges as I see them from my perspective. I phrase these as questions that need to be addressed. That was guideline developers. This is a view of the full process. You have this on your last slide. I'm not going to read them. You can review them. I also have implications, which I won't go into because we're out of time, regarding comparative effectiveness research and challenges that comparative effectiveness research presents for those of us in social research. Comparative effectiveness research is terribly important for evidence-based practice. The question is no longer, is this intervention better or is this policy better than a placebo or treatment as usual? The issue now is among available alternative credible policies or interventions, which is better in my circumstance than another. It's the issue of comparing realistic, thoughtful alternatives. That's what comparative effectiveness research is about. It is also about involving clients, populations in the decision-making process from day one to the end. From what are the important questions to be addressed, how do we analyze the data, interpret the data, on through how do we report the results. So there are issues and challenges and much to think about here. I expect that CER will have a significant impact on shaping policy and practice research in the evaluation of social intervention in the next decade. The character of CER, to a large extent, will be shaped by how stakeholders respond to the issues, limitations, and questions that are now before us. This promises to be an exciting journey for those interested in methodological developments that shape policy and practice decisions in the human services. I hope I have made a reasonable case for expanding and enriching the concept of evidence as applied to EBP. Beyond my specific suggestions and identification of issues on this slide, I hope that I have stimulated your thinking sufficiently so that some of you may be motivated to push these ideas or challenge positions that I have taken. I acknowledge and thank Peter Atkinstein for his comments on my draft, to Haluk Soyden, and to Jennifer Bellamy for their critical and helpful comments on the first draft of this presentation. Thank you for your attention through what I know has been a long and rather dry lecture.
Thank you very much, Ed. I don't know if it's obvious to everybody, but that was radical. Some of the things that we rely on, we shouldn't rely on, and Ed, as ever, is giving us an opportunity to move evidence-based practice on. I think that's remarkable, and I thank Ed very much for that. We need to move on. We are slightly late. You need to find your next place to be. But thank you very much, Ed, for taking us into a new era of evidence-based.
Excuse me, before you go, I just wanted to say something, for two things. One thing is that specifically, if you're looking for the room A, which will be the most difficult to find, they are within the library. So you have to reach the library, which is just above the entrance, and then enter the library, and then you will find the A. I've been asked, so I say. And the second thing, and you climb the stairs within the library. They are within the library. So the second thing is that in the afternoon there will be the special interest group. I will provide more information so that you can find printed information about the special interest group. And I hope that you will find, we have united some of the groups. We have put them together because they were close, and we thought that we didn't have enough people in them. But I hope that more people will be part of them, more than the one that signed in on the network.